She arrived carrying nothing but a cracked leather valise and a simple green notebook, holding in her hands the secret that would eventually save a man who no longer wished to live. Can you possibly imagine the agonizing pain of being discarded by your own blood family, only to finally discover your true worth in the arms of a bitter stranger? This extraordinary story of resilience and deep love took place in rural upstate New York during the unforgiving autumn of 1932. Before we dive into the shadowy corridors and the buried secrets of the Golden Linden estate, leave a comment below telling me which city or state you are watching this journey of emotion and fresh starts from. I absolutely love knowing how far our stories are reaching and forming this great community of sensitive hearts. The cold wind of that November afternoon bit at Cecilia's face as she walked down the dirt road, feeling the crushing weight of every single step. The pale country dust clung to the hem of her faded cotton dress, but she paid no mind to the grime, for her soul already bore marks that were far more profound. For 24 long years, she had been the best-kept secret and the most useful tool of her uncle and aunt, Arthur and Beatrice, raised in the dark, dusty back rooms of the family's mercantile store in Manhattan. Cecilia had never known the warmth of an embrace or the sweetness of a compliment. Her sole function was to exist in the shadows, buried under piles of promissory notes and heavy ledgers, performing the complex accounting that enriched her relatives. Beatrice used to say, with her shrill and grating voice, that a girl with no physical attractions and no worldly possessions was only good for counting other people's pennies, demanding that her niece keep her head down and her mouth firmly shut. The cruel expulsion happened on a rainy morning, without any warning and without an ounce of pity, when Arthur decided to sell the store and move the family to high society, claiming there was no more room in their luggage for the niece who had served them so flawlessly. Thrown into the unforgiving street with only a few pieces of clothing and her precious green-covered notebook, Cecilia boarded the first freight train that agreed to take her in exchange for scrubbing the cargo cars. Now, with her feet covered in painful blisters and her throat parched, she caught sight of the large rusted iron gates of the Golden Linden estate. The place, which must have been breathtakingly imposing once upon a time, now exhibited clear signs of utter abandonment. The wooden fences were collapsing, tall weeds choked the cobblestone paths, and the massive linden tree that gave the property its name raised its bare, dry branches toward the grey sky, stripped of any foliage. It was a perfect, haunting reflection of what the townspeople said about the owner of those lands. The main house emerged on the horizon like a sleeping giant, with its peeling paint and shuttered windows that looked like eyes tightly closed to the world. Cecilia clapped her hands at the side gate, the sound echoing mournfully across the empty yard, until the kitchen door finally creaked open with a slow drag. A white-haired woman with her locks tied in a stern bun appeared, wiping her hands on an apron that smelled warmly of cloves and cinnamon. It was Mrs. Martha, the cook, and the only employee who had remained on the vast property. With her eyes narrowed in initial suspicion, Martha asked what such a tiny, exhausted-looking girl was doing, lost in those parts. Cecilia swallowed her burning shame, clutched the handle of her valise tightly against her chest, and answered with a trembling voice that she was looking for absolutely any kind of work in exchange for a roof over her head and a plate of food. Martha let out a deep sigh, a sound heavy with compassion and weariness, and pushed the heavy wooden door open, inviting the young woman inside. The kitchen was the only place in that immense house that seemed to harbor any life, heated by the roaring warmth of the wood-burning stove and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. As she served a steaming mug and a generous, comforting slice of warm cornbread, the old cook explained the estate's desolate situation. The boss, Mr. Garrett, was a man who had died on the inside exactly 5 years ago, on the very day he lost his beloved wife to a sudden, violent fever. Since that tragic afternoon, he had dismissed nearly all the farmhands, let the sprawling apple orchards rot on the branch, and locked himself away in the impenetrable silence of his own grief. Martha whispered, looking around as if the very walls could eavesdrop, that the grand house desperately needed someone to dust off the lingering memories, but she sternly warned that the boss was a man of very few words and a remarkably dark temper. It was precisely at that moment that heavy, sluggish footsteps echoed across the wooden floorboards of the hallway, causing Cecilia's heart to race wildly in her chest. The kitchen door was pushed open by a large, calloused hand, revealing Garrett's imposing figure. He was a tall man, with broad shoulders that looked as though they carried the weight of the entire world, and a thick, unkempt beard that hid a good portion of a face deeply marked by exhaustion. His eyes, a brown so incredibly dark they almost appeared black, carried a sadness so dense that Cecilia felt a sudden chill run down her spine. Garrett stopped at the doorframe, narrowed his fierce gaze at the intruder sitting at his table, and asked Martha, in a deep, gravelly voice that resembled the rumble of distant thunder, who this stranger was. Martha quickly positioned herself between the two, hurriedly explaining that the girl was in desperate need of work and that the big house had simply grown too large to be properly cleaned by her own aging hands. Garrett crossed his strong arms over his chest, analyzing Cecilia from head to toe with a cold indifference that wounded more deeply than any spoken insult ever could. He warned her with sharp harshness that he had absolutely no money to pay for luxuries, and that the estate was rapidly sinking into a swamp of debts on the verge of being seized by the bank. Cecilia, completely defying the ingrained instinct to lower her head that her aunt and uncle had viciously beaten into her, lifted her chin and looked directly into the brooding farmer's eyes. She replied, with a sudden firmness that surprised even herself, that she wasn't asking for any luxuries. She only wanted the chance to prove that her hands were hard-working and that she possessed no fear of heavy, grueling labor. The heavy silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, filled only by the crackling of the firewood in the stove. Finally, Garrett looked away, let out a massive, weary sigh, and stated she could stay in the back servants' room, imposing the house's single, unbreakable rule. She was never, under any circumstances whatsoever, to enter the locked office at the far end of the hallway. During those first few days, Cecilia's new routine was a brutal test of both physical and emotional endurance. The tiny room she was given smelled faintly of mildew, and had a single narrow window that barely let in the morning sunlight. But to her, it was the very first piece of the world she could genuinely call her own. She woke up long before the roosters even thought to crow, tied on her apron, and began the arduous battle against the years of neglect that blanketed the big house's mahogany furniture. Her hands, which were once soft from holding nothing but fountain pens, now blistered and bled from gripping straw brooms and stiff-bristled scrubbing brushes. However, the punishing manual labor could not silence Cecilia's brilliantly sharp mind. As she scrubbed the floorboards of the main corridor, her eyes were constantly drawn to the heavy oak door at the end of the passage, the only door that remained perpetually locked and shrouded in mystery. The atmosphere inside the house was entirely dominated by a suffocating melancholy, dictated by Garrett's solitary, echoing footsteps. The farmer spent his long days riding aimlessly on horseback through the dying orchards, returning only at dusk, thoroughly exhausted and caked in dirt. The interaction between the two of them was virtually non-existent, limited to brief, clipped nods and plates of hot food left strategically on the grand dining room table. But Cecilia, possessing an incredibly observant spirit sharpened by decades of mandatory silence, began to notice the minute, telling details. She saw how Garrett's large hands trembled ever so slightly when he gripped his coffee cup. She noticed the deeply suppressed sighs when he stared out the window at his lost, ruined crops. and she clearly registered the frightening pile of envelopes bearing the bank's official seal that accumulated entirely unopened on the entryway console. Her mathematical mind instantly processed that information, tangibly feeling the impending financial ruin hovering menacingly over the very roof that currently sheltered her. The profound shift in their dynamic began in the most subtle of ways, communicated entirely through invisible, quiet gestures. Cecilia noticed that Garrett had a habit of leaving his heavy wool coat thrown carelessly over the porch chair, exposed to the damp, biting chill of the night dew. One evening, without uttering a single word, she picked up the weighty garment, carefully brushed the dried dirt from its sleeves, and hung it neatly on the brass coat rack in the foyer, making sure to align the farmer's muddy boots perfectly next to the front door. The next morning, when Garrett discovered his belongings so thoughtfully cared for, he paused for a long, heavy moment in the middle of the hallway. His dark eyes sought out Cecilia's petite figure as she dusted the living room shelves, and a low murmur that sounded suspiciously like a vague "thank you" slipped past his lips before he quickly stepped out into the fields. It was the very first time she felt his gaze land on her, not as an unwanted intruder, but as someone who genuinely belonged in that space. The narrative tension, however, grew exponentially with every unread letter the rural postman left at the front gate. On one particularly oppressive, muggy afternoon, wholly typical of the days that precede massive autumn thunderstorms, the mail carrier placed a bright red envelope directly into Cecilia's hands. The thick, rigid paper and the stark stamp of the county clerk's office practically reeked of urgency and legal threat. When Garrett returned late that afternoon, his handsome face covered by a thick sheen of exhaustion and sweat, Cecilia hesitated visibly before handing over the mail. She extended her pale hand, holding out the ominous red envelope, and explained in a quiet, cautious voice that the postman had explicitly stated it was urgent. The farmer snatched the letter roughly, tore the end of the paper with his teeth, and devoured the lines of text rapidly. Cecilia watched the color completely drain from his face, his jaw clenching with such immense force that a muscle visibly twitched in his cheek. He crumpled the paper violently, hurled it onto the floorboard with terrifying rage, and marched with heavy, stomping steps toward his bedroom, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. That very night, the promised storm crashed down upon the Golden Linden estate with unbridled, terrifying fury. The roaring thunder made the glass window panes vibrate violently, and the gale-force wind howled through the cracks of the old slate roof like a chorus of tormented souls. Cecilia tossed and turned in her narrow cot, entirely unable to find sleep, the relentless drumming of the rain mixing with the muffled, heartbroken sobs she swore she heard emanating from the boss's bedroom. Driven by a nervous restlessness she simply could not control, she lit a small kerosene lantern, wrapped a thick wool shawl tightly over her nightgown, and wandered through the pitch-black corridors to check if any windows had been blown open. The midnight chill penetrated deep into her bones, but it wasn't the plummeting temperature that caused her heart to hammer erratically against her ribs. It was the shocking sight that revealed itself when she reached the end of the main hallway. Garrett's absolute unspoken rule had been shattered by pure chance. The heavy oak door to the office, always so meticulously locked away, stood ajar. The violent wind howling in through a shattered window pane at the back of the room pushed the door violently back and forth, making its rusted hinges squeal like a dying lament. Cecilia approached with achingly slow steps, the glass lantern trembling noticeably in her grip. She peeked through the crack, deeply fearing the farmer's wrath, but the room was utterly devoid of people, populated instead by chaotic mountains of paper, mouldering accounting ledgers, and empty whiskey bottles piled haphazardly in the shadowy corners. The pouring rain whipped fiercely through the broken window, blowing directly onto the massive mahogany desk where the estate's critical financial ledgers lay wide open. The pooling water was rapidly smudging the ink of the fountain pens, literally washing away the absolute last remnants of control Garrett was desperately trying to maintain over his crumbling life. Without giving a single thought to the dire consequences, propelled forward by the profound, intrinsic instinct that defined her very essence, Cecilia pushed the door open and boldly stepped into the forbidden sanctuary. The overwhelming stench of old, decaying paper, wet dust and harsh alcohol struck her face like a physical blow. She sprinted toward the window, fighting valiantly against the cutting wind, and managed to heave the heavy wooden shutters closed, successfully locking the violent tempest outside. The absolute silence that instantly settled within the room was incredibly heavy, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of rainwater running off the edge of the desk onto the wide plank floor. Cecilia set the lantern down on a dry patch of the mahogany wood and stared down at the soaked, ruined documents. Her slender fingers, accustomed to elegantly dancing over columns of complex numbers her entire life, reached out to touch the damp, wrinkled pages with an almost religious reverence. The ink was severely smudged, but her brilliant mind did not need perfectly crisp numbers to immediately comprehend the scale of the disaster. She pulled out the worn leather chair, sat down firmly in front of the desk, and began to carefully separate the wet invoices and receipts with extreme delicacy, as if she were tending to open, bleeding wounds. The flickering golden light of the lantern illuminated row after row of atrociously poor calculations, shockingly abusive compound interest rates charged by the mercantile bank, and bulk sales of apple harvests recorded at ridiculously minuscule fractions of their true value. Cecilia's suppressed genius, violently stifled by years of relentless humiliation, suddenly awakened with an uncontrollable, blazing force. She realized instantly that Garrett was being systematically swindled by the greedy middlemen in the city, and that the mountain of debt the bank was aggressively calling in contained glaring, deliberate mathematical errors exclusively favoring the creditors. The great estate was not bankrupt due to poor soil or bad weather. It was being bled dry by the deliberate blindness of a man drowning in grief, and by the vicious greed of vultures eagerly feasting upon his suffering. With steady, determined hands, Cecilia reached into the deep pocket of her shawl and pulled out her absolute greatest treasure, her green-covered notebook. The small, unassuming object, with its yellowing pages, where she used to flawlessly calculate the profits of her cruel aunt and uncle, would now serve a vastly superior, nobler purpose. She located a dry fountain pen tucked away in Garrett's desk drawer, dipped the metal nib deeply into an inkwell that had miraculously survived the rain, and immediately went to work. The dark hours flew by unnoticed as the night advanced. Cecilia filled the pristine green pages with her meticulous, elegant handwriting, ruthlessly cross-referencing data, recalculating compound interest rates, identifying massive legal loopholes in the sales contracts, and masterfully drafting comprehensive financial recovery charts. She was so completely immersed in the beautiful universe of numbers, so intoxicated by the absolute clarity of her own brilliant solutions, that she completely lost all sense of danger and of the physical space surrounding her. The raging storm outside finally began to yield, giving way to the timid, sweet songs of the first morning birds, when a completely different sound abruptly sliced through the air of the room. It was not the wind, nor was it the rain. It was the unmistakable, terrifying creak of a heavy leather boot pressing down on the wooden floorboards directly behind her chair. Cecilia's blood turned entirely to ice in her veins. The gold nib of her fountain pen froze dead in the middle of a number, allowing a dark drop of ink to permanently stain the otherwise impeccable page. She felt the overwhelming, imposing presence even before she heard the voice. The potent scent of cold tobacco and strong black coffee violently invaded her nostrils. The very air behind her seemed to grow incredibly dense, vibrating with a suffocating tension that completely stole her breath. Cecilia squeezed her eyes shut with all her might, bracing herself for the inevitable scream of fury, fully expecting to be violently thrown out into the mud like a mangy dog, utterly terrified of reliving the worst day of her life at the hands of her vicious relatives. Garrett's voice sounded so incredibly close to her ear that the farmer's hot breath literally raised the hairs on the back of her neck. He did not scream. His tone was dangerously low, gravelly with fresh sleep, and completely torn by a profound, echoing disbelief, demanding to know what in the hell she thought she was doing in there. Cecilia swallowed dryly, clutched the green notebook tightly against her chest like a protective shield, and slowly, agonizingly, swiveled the chair around. Garrett stood towering over her, wearing only the rumpled trousers from the previous night, and a white cotton shirt left unbuttoned at the chest, clearly revealing the tense, coiled muscles beneath. His dark brown eyes swept over the newly organized desk, the drying notes perfectly aligned in neat rows, and finally landed squarely on the ink-stained hands of the tiny, trembling woman sitting before him. The silence that settled between them was more deafening than the loudest thunderclap of the entire night, heavily loaded with a monumental weight that would forever alter the destiny of them both. She was just about to stammer a response, but Garrett's piercing gaze fell upon the open page of the green notebook, where the brilliant, undeniable numbers clearly mapped out not only the miraculous salvation of his beloved lands, but the undeniable, irreversible beginning of the healing of his own shattered soul. The quiet in the office was so thick that Cecilia could actually hear the erratic, terrified beating of her own heart, echoing painfully against her ribs. Garrett remained perfectly motionless, like a statue carved from solid stone, his heavy breathing shifting the pale, wrinkled fabric of his shirt, while his dark, unfathomable eyes traveled slowly from the small woman cowering in the leather chair to the open pages of the green notebook illuminated by the lantern's trembling flame. Cecilia squeezed her eyes shut so tightly that little stars danced in her vision, anticipating at any passing second the roaring shout of rage that would banish her back to the muddy roads, the freezing rain, and the total darkness from which she had so recently fled. But the sound that broke the stillness of the dawn was not a terrifying roar of anger. Instead, it was the slow, exhausted dragging of a heavy wooden chair. Garrett sat down slowly directly across from her, resting his large, heavily calloused elbows on the damp mahogany desk, entirely ignoring the rainwater that still steadily dripped from the poorly sealed window. He didn't look like a furious man. Rather, he looked like someone who had just been violently shaken awake from a deep trance that had lasted half a decade. With a voice that was hoarse, incredibly low and raspy from sheer lack of use, he pointed a surprisingly trembling finger at the flawless columns of numbers written in fresh blue ink, and asked in barely more than a whisper what exactly those meticulous annotations next to the bank's crushing demands actually meant. Cecilia swallowed hard again, feeling her dry throat scratch painfully, and clamped her ink-stained hands firmly in her lap over her faded dress to hide the uncontrollable shaking of her fingers. She desperately gathered every single drop of courage that still resided in her bruised soul, pulled the brass base of the lantern slightly closer, and, completely forgetting for one miraculous moment the paralyzing fear of her past traumas, allowed her long-dormant genius to finally take the lead. With her index finger still smudged with dark ink, Cecilia patiently showed Garrett, line by agonizing line, exactly how the mercantile bank of Stone Creek had blatantly and illegally altered the due dates on his mortgages, magically transforming an old, manageable debt of $20,000 into an unpayable, entirely fraudulent mountain of nearly $60,000. She explained, her voice gaining undeniable firmness and authority with every single word she pronounced, that the estate produced incredibly high-quality apples, but the local buyers and city middlemen were outright lying about the official commodities exchange rates just to pay him absolute pennies for the golden harvests that came from his soil. Garrett listened to every single syllable with a feverish, unbreakable attention, his dark eyes locked intensely onto the pale, highly focused face of the young woman bathed in the yellow flame. He slowly passed his massive hand over his bearded face, deeply marked by years of fatigue, and let out a long, shaky sigh that seemed to physically release years of an invisible, crushing burden from his broad shoulders. The earthy smell of wet paper, old dust and melted wax entirely filled the small space between them, suddenly creating a bubble of intense, transformative intimacy. Instead of screaming and kicking her out, the rugged farmer leaned his broad back against the wooden chair, looked incredibly deeply into Cecilia's brown, frightened eyes, and told her, with a surprising, heartbreaking softness that practically tore her soul wide open, that she would absolutely never scrub another floor in that house, and she would never wash another grimy pot again. Starting from that exact day, he informed her with an unshakable, ironclad certainty the mahogany desk in that office would be her rightful place, because she had managed to clearly see in the pitch darkness what he had utterly failed to see in the broad light of day. The violent storm outside finally began to taper off into a gentle, misty drizzle, while inside that small room, a glorious new era officially commenced for the Golden Linden estate. The following morning brought a change so incredibly palpable to the atmosphere of the property that even the crisp autumn air seemed noticeably lighter and vastly easier to breathe. When the golden sun finally broke through the heavy, lingering storm clouds, Martha nearly dropped a piping hot tray of freshly baked biscuits right onto the tile floor when she saw the boss stride into her kitchen. Garrett was completely clean-shaven for the first time in 5 long years, proudly revealing a strong, handsome jawline and a face that was actually still remarkably young. He wore freshly laundered, thick cotton clothes and walked with a tall, incredibly straight posture, entirely lacking the ghostly, hunching weight that used to bend him over. He politely asked for 2 cups of strong black coffee and marched straight down the main hallway, leaving the heavy office door wide open so that the bright, clear morning light could effectively sweep away the lingering shadows of the painful past. Cecilia, still highly fearful that the entire previous night had merely been a feverish, exhaustion-induced delusion, stepped into the room incredibly hesitantly, clutching her green notebook tightly against her chest as if it were a physical shield. Garrett had spent the entire first hour of his morning meticulously cleaning the mess off the floor, sweeping up the shattered glass from the broken window, and carefully placing a smaller, beautifully upholstered chair, perfectly adjusted to her petite height, on the opposite side of the massive mahogany desk. He gently offered the steaming cup to her, the highly comforting aroma of roasted beans filling the quiet space between them, and murmured a deeply sincere apology for ever making her sleep in such a freezing, damp room at the back of the house, openly admitting his profound shame for completely failing to see the human treasure he was housing under his own roof. Cecilia's pale face grew intensely hot, flushing her cheeks a vivid, beautiful red and a timid, fragile smile, the very first one she had worn in many, many years of profound sadness, curved the corner of her chapped lips. In that exact instant, as she tasted the warm, bitter coffee, she felt the crushing invisibility imposed upon her by her cruel relatives. Her entire life began to melt away, just like morning frost under the blazing sun. The harsh winter months that followed engaged them in a harmonious, tireless dance of incredibly hard work and deep, unspoken complicity. Their daily routine evolved into a perfectly synchronized ballet where her brilliant, sharp intellect flawlessly met his brute, determined strength, while Garrett spent his freezing days out in the open fields beneath the pale winter sky, gathering the few remaining farmhands, repairing rotting fences, and aggressively applying the new, advanced pruning and planting techniques that Cecilia had read and painstakingly translated from old French agronomy journals she found in the library. She fiercely commanded the real, bloody war on paper. Armed with a gorgeous new gold-nibbed fountain pen that Garrett had purchased specially for her in town, and heavily protected by the undeniable facts in the pages of her green notebook, Cecilia ruthlessly drafted dozens of unforgiving letters, written with utterly perfect grammar and a tone of irrefutable, terrifying authority, directed at the bank directors in the city and the greedy regional middlemen. In these blistering letters, she explicitly detailed every single mathematical fraud she had uncovered and openly threatened to expose their highly illegal compound interest calculations directly to the federal authorities. The panicked response from the terrified city suits did not take long to arrive via the postal mailbags. The gigantic, crippling debts were magically and swiftly renegotiated down to their actual fair value, and the previously arrogant creditors suddenly began sending incredibly respectful proposals for final settlement. With every single victory officially stamped on paper, the dense, suffocating darkness that used to inhabit Garrett's eyes dissipated a little bit more, rapidly replaced by a bright, shining glimmer of hope that Cecilia secretly found to be the most fascinating thing in the entire world. The long nights spent in the office ceased to be moments of agonizing despair and miraculously transformed into a sacred, beautiful refuge for both of them. They regularly stayed awake well into the early hours of the dawn, softly illuminated by the glow of the oil lamps, entirely surrounded by soil samples, sacks of seeds, and meticulously hand-drawn financial spreadsheets, fervently exchanging exciting ideas that quickly and inevitably dissolved into profound, intimate conversations about life, about their deepest fears, and about their shared future. It was exactly on those long, freezing nights of January that true love really began to weave its deepest, strongest roots, not with the explosive, loud declarations of cheap dime-store romances, but with the careful, incredibly tender delicacy of someone stepping onto newly ploughed, highly sacred ground. Cecilia, with her remarkably sharp perception, frequently noticed the exact way Garrett's dark eyes lingered on her whenever he mistakenly thought she wasn't looking, watching in utter fascination as the loose strands of brown hair inevitably escaped her rushed bun and fell softly against the pale, delicate skin of her neck. One particularly freezing night, at the absolute peak of the rigorous winter that blanketed the estate in thick white snow, Cecilia fell fast asleep directly over her scattered papers, utterly exhausted after successfully balancing the highly complex financial ledger for the semester. Garrett, instead of roughly waking her up to send her to bed, stood up in total silence, carefully removed the thick wool coat he was wearing, and gently draped it over her small, fragile shoulders with an infinite heartbreaking tenderness, delicately adjusting the collar so the biting chill wouldn't touch her skin. When Cecilia finally woke up the next morning, with her cheek literally creased by the paper, and breathing in the unmistakable, intoxicating scent of sweet tobacco and shaving soap permanently infused into the warm fabric of the coat, her heart gave a wild, erratic leap that had absolutely nothing to do with being startled. Later that same incredibly decisive week, while the two of them were closely reviewing a hand-drawn topographical map of the vast property spread out over the desk, their hands accidentally collided over the rough parchment paper when they both reached to point at the exact same water spring. The shockingly warm touch lasted only a few fleeting seconds longer than was strictly necessary, but the invisible, crackling electricity that rushed through Cecilia's skin made her violently hold her breath, her wide eyes glued to the map. Garrett did not pull his hand away immediately. Instead, he very gently turned her small hand palm up, softly stroked the calluses she had earned, scrubbing his floors during her first weeks with his own rough thumb, and whispered, his deep voice heavily choked with raw emotion, that those bruised, battered hands had miraculously given back the life and the dignity he genuinely thought he had lost forever. The entire world seemed to completely stop spinning in that exact instant, leaving behind only the rhythmic sound of their shared breathing and the hurried, frantic beating of two battered hearts that had finally, truly found a home. The absolute necessity of formally finalizing the debt forgiveness officially forced them to make a long, dusty journey to the town of Stone Creek at the end of August. The highly polished wooden buggy cut swiftly through the dirt road, kicking up a massive cloud of pale golden dust beneath the blazing midday sun. Cecilia wore one of her very oldest dresses, which was now spotlessly clean and perfectly starched by Mrs. Martha, and sat intimately close beside Garrett, feeling the farmer's broad shoulder comfortably brush against hers with every single bump in the road. The town was a bustling cluster of cobblestone streets, fabric shops, grain elevators, and grand colonial houses. When their buggy rolled to a halt in front of the highly imposing white marble building of the Mercantile Bank, the townspeople in the square literally stopped to stare. Garrett hadn't set foot inside the town limits in 5 long years, and the shocking sight of the wealthy, widowed farmer, now looking incredibly healthy, standing tall and wearing a perfectly tailored linen suit, accompanied by a petite, highly intelligent-looking woman, fiercely clutching a green notebook, instantly generated a wild buzz of gossip among the ladies leaving the church. They confidently stepped into the bank branch, where the air was unnaturally cold and smelled strongly of floor wax and old money. The branch manager, a Mr. Carter, was a man with a highly prominent belly, gold-rimmed spectacles perched precariously on his nose, and a disdainful, arrogant smile that bordered on the absolutely ridiculous. He received them in his double-doored office, gesturing for them to sit in the plush leather armchairs with a painfully fake, oily cordiality. Carter immediately launched into his well-rehearsed, patronizing speech, stating in a slow drawl how very sorry he was about the farmer's tragic financial situation, but insisting that numbers simply did not lie, and the bank had no choice but to foreclose on the precious lands. Garrett leisurely crossed his long legs, maintained an utterly impenetrable expression, and stated with absolute terrifying calm that he would be handing the floor over to his chief financial manager. The arrogant manager blinked his beady little eyes, visibly confused, and asked with a scoff if the farmer was making some sort of joke by bringing an errand girl to discuss serious men's business. It was exactly then that Cecilia adjusted herself in the large leather chair. She did not lower her head. For the very first time in her entire life, sitting directly across from a terrifying figure of authority, she proudly raised her chin. She slammed the green notebook open right on top of the manager's pristine mahogany desk, unscrewed her gold fountain pen, and began to ruthlessly fire off the undeniable facts. With a voice that was crystal clear, undeniably firm, and completely devoid of even a single drop of hesitation, Cecilia systematically listed the exact legal statutes regarding usury, effortlessly demonstrated the shockingly gross illegal failures in the compound interest calculations, and laid out side by side the signed harvest receipts that the corrupt bank had actively tried to hide. She spoke brilliantly of profit margins, international commodities exchange rates for grain, and undeniably proved in less than 10 minutes of an absolutely brilliant, legally irrefutable monologue that the bank not only possessed absolutely zero right to seize the estate's lands, but in fact legally owed a highly significant, massive cash refund to the Golden Linden estate. Mr. Carter immediately began to sweat profusely, frantically pulling a linen handkerchief from his vest pocket to furiously mop his balding forehead, his previous arrogance evaporating as quickly as water on a hot iron skillet. He stammered pathetically, desperately tried to argue back, but was utterly, flawlessly crushed by the terrifying surgical precision of Cecilia's brilliant mind. Garrett sat back and watched the entire spectacle with a crooked half-smile that was completely impossible to hide, his dark eyes shining with a pride so incredibly immense and profound that his broad chest seemed almost too small to contain it. At the end of the brutal meeting, the thoroughly defeated manager signed the final release documents with a violently trembling hand, officially stamping the permanent, absolute freedom of the beloved estate. If you are cheering wildly for this wonderful twist and thrilling at Cecilia's brilliant intelligence, putting those arrogant suits in their rightful place, leave your opinion in the comments below about what you thought of her incredible attitude. It is truly wonderful to see when honest truth and raw talent utterly defeat arrogance and greed. Don't forget to leave your like if this beautiful story of fresh starts is touching your heart. The scenic carriage ride back to the estate took place in the late afternoon, under a vast sky brilliantly painted with spectacular, breathtaking shades of burning orange, deep purple, and fiery red. The atmosphere inside the buggy was one of a silent, buzzing euphoria, a deep peace of mind that neither of them had experienced in many, many long years. Halfway through the journey, while the horses trotted at a relaxing, steady pace, Garrett gently pulled back on the leather reins and halted the carriage right next to a small, babbling creek of crystal-clear water. He climbed down gracefully, walked around to Cecilia's side, and extended his large, warm hand to carefully help her step down. Without saying a single word, he gently guided her to the edge of the cool water, where the soothing freshness of the late evening effectively calmed the residual heat of the day. He reached deep into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, highly polished wooden box, handing it over to her with a sweet hesitation that charmingly contrasted with his massive size. He softly asked her to open it. Nestled safely inside, resting upon a bed of rich red velvet, lay a magnificent fountain pen with a solid gold nib, incredibly delicate and beautifully crafted. Garrett looked incredibly deeply into Cecilia's rapidly tearing eyes and told her that a mind so phenomenally brilliant and capable of saving a man's entire world should absolutely never have to use a common, cheap pen ever again. A single, solitary tear rolled slowly down her flushed cheek, not born of sadness, but of the absolute purest, most overwhelming gratitude. The physical space between them rapidly diminished, their breaths tangling together in the cool evening air, and although there wasn't a kiss shared in that perfectly flawless moment, the incredibly gentle resting of their foreheads together was a loud, silent promise that from that magnificent day forward, they belonged entirely to one another in both body and soul. The months flew by rapidly, and spring finally arrived with a sweeping, breathtaking force, miraculously transforming the golden Linden estate into a literal paradise on earth. The apple orchards, which were previously dead and withered, now proudly exhibited endless, perfectly aligned rows of vibrant, deep green leaves and thousands of delicate white blossoms that exhaled a sweet, intoxicating perfume into every single corner of the property. The yard of the grand main house had been impeccably cleaned, the wooden fences freshly painted a blinding white, and the broken roof slates entirely replaced. But the absolute main spectacle was the colossal tree, situated exactly in the center of the grounds. The grand linden tree exploded into a bloom so incredibly intense and golden that it looked as if it had literally stolen the light straight from the sun, generously covering the ground all around it with a luminous, breathtaking carpet of golden petals. The big house itself had gained entirely new life. The large windows were now always thrown wide open, the delicate lace curtains danced merrily in the warm breeze, and Mrs. Martha finally had a team of giggling helpers in the kitchen, singing old joyful folk songs while joyously preparing massive, hearty feasts for the numerous farmhands. Garrett was an entirely new man. He smiled with incredible ease, conversed openly with the workers as absolute equals, and his rich lands were actively breaking every known harvest record, aggressively attracting the attention of wealthy buyers from all across the country. The fame of the miraculous agricultural and financial resurrection of the Golden Linden estate spread as quickly as wildfire in dry prairie grass, crossing mountains and valleys, until it finally reached the stuffy, luxurious parlors of the city elite in Manhattan. Up there, the financial scenario was drastically and poetically different for Cecilia's cruel aunt and uncle. Arthur and Beatrice's mercantile store, which had previously only been highly profitable thanks exclusively to their niece's hidden, slave-like labor, was now rapidly sinking into an unescapable ocean of crushing debt, generated solely by the couple's own staggering incompetence and vicious greed. Their store shelves were thickly coated in dust, their wealthy clients had entirely vanished, and aggressive creditors violently banged on their door on a daily basis, aggressively demanding payment for long overdue promissory notes. It was on a bleak, chilly November afternoon, sitting in a decadent, fading downtown coffee shop, that Arthur overheard a traveling merchant loudly recounting the incredible story of the rural estate that had miraculously tripled its profits thanks to a brilliant new financial manager, a young woman described specifically as petite, highly observant, possessing an utterly flawless handwriting and carrying an absolutely inseparable green notebook. The highly specific description struck Arthur like a bolt of lightning. He literally ran back home, found Beatrice pathetically counting the few miserable coins remaining in the cash register, and breathlessly revealed the shocking discovery. Pure, unadulterated envy and malice instantly flared in the older woman's eyes like hot coals in pitch darkness. Suddenly realizing that the very niece they had so viciously kicked to the curb was now comfortably sitting upon an absolute gold mine, they immediately hatched a perverse, deeply petty plan to ruthlessly extort money from the wealthy farmer. Deciding to maliciously weaponize the absolute only weak point that the strict societal norms of the era allowed them to exploit: a woman's reputation. Just 2 days later, the idyllic early afternoon peace on the thriving estate was violently ripped apart by the incredibly shrill, grating sound of a rented carriage's iron wheels aggressively crushing the fine gravel of the main driveway. Cecilia was sitting peacefully on the freshly painted front porch, sipping a delicate cup of chamomile tea and meticulously reviewing the international commodities exchange rates in her beloved green notebook, when the dark, imposing vehicle stopped abruptly right beneath the golden dappled shade of the linden tree. All the blood instantly drained from her face, leaving her as terrifyingly pale as white wax, the very instant the heavy wooden carriage doors swung open. Arthur stepped out first, wearing a highly rumpled, cheap pinstripe suit, his fingernails caked in grime, and the distinctly sour stench of cheap tobacco deeply embedded in his clothes, closely followed by Beatrice, whose overly powdered round face sported a sickeningly malicious smile, heavily loaded with the purest, most toxic venom. The sudden, overwhelming panic born of years of uninterrupted, horrific humiliation instantly paralyzed Cecilia's legs. Her hands began to shake so violently that the delicate porcelain teacup entirely slipped from her grasp, shattering violently against the wooden floorboards with a sharp, echoing crash, spilling the scalding hot tea directly over her shoes. Beatrice arrogantly climbed the first few steps of the wooden porch, lazily fanning herself with a fan made of faded, cheap feathers, staring greedily at the immense grandeur of the beautifully restored estate with wide, incredibly hungry eyes. She crossed her thick, flabby arms, and mockingly greeted her terrified niece with a deeply cutting irony, shouting loudly enough so that every single farmhand nearby could clearly hear her, viciously declaring that the ugly, utterly useless little runt of the family had apparently finally found a remarkably easy, highly twisted way to rapidly climb the social ladder and sleep in incredibly soft beds. Arthur casually leaned against the wooden porch pillar with a sickeningly arrogant posture, aggressively lit a foul-smelling cigar, and maliciously added, deliberately blowing the noxious grey smoke directly into Cecilia's face, that it was truly, remarkably impressive how a plain, unmarried girl with absolutely zero physical attractions managed to successfully extract so much money from a wealthy, grieving widower simply by sharing the exact same roof without the sacred, highly required bounds of holy matrimony. The vile, disgusting words sliced through the peaceful air like poisoned razors, aimed specifically and deliberately at utterly destroying the exact dignity that Cecilia had fought so incredibly hard to painstakingly rebuild over those last few months. The incredibly shrill, jarring sound of the aggressive foreign voices immediately attracted Garrett, who marched out from the grand hallway with incredibly long, forceful strides, casually wiping his massive, calloused hands on a thick cotton towel after washing his face. When he laid eyes on Cecilia, pathetically cowering against the brick wall, visibly struggling to breathe, her dark brown eyes literally overflowing with the absolute purest, most primal terror, and her small frame trembling uncontrollably, the protective, fierce instincts of the massive farmer instantly skyrocketed into a maximum, highly primal state of red alert. He leapt down the porch steps in 2 giant bounds, immediately planting himself like an absolutely impenetrable, broad-shouldered brick wall right between Cecilia and the petty intruders, and furiously demanded to know, with a booming voice of pure thunder that literally made the glass windows of the house violently rattle, exactly who these vile people were and what in the hell they thought they were doing, trespassing on his lands. Arthur, loudly swallowing dryly and clearly, visibly intimidated by Garrett's colossal size and terrifying rage, took a deeply cowardly step backward, but Beatrice, completely blinded by her desperate, ravenous greed, boldly assumed the front line. She aggressively jutted out her double chin, putting on a sickeningly fake, deeply disgusting display of Christian morality, and shrieked at the top of her lungs that they were Cecilia's blood family, the highly loving aunt and uncle who had sacrificed everything to raise her, and that they were there to rightfully repair the deeply stained, ruined honor of their good family name. Beatrice eagerly began to explain, happily dripping her carefully calculated, highly toxic venom, that the mere presence of an unmarried young woman living completely alone with a fully capable man under those incredibly intimate conditions was undeniably the absolute greatest, most immoral scandal of the entire decade. She viciously threatened, baring her yellowed teeth in an ugly sneer, that they would immediately return to the city and gleefully expose to all of high society, to the local newspaper publishers, and to all the major agricultural buyers exactly how shameful, promiscuous, and deeply sinful their living arrangement truly was. The wicked plan was to completely ruin the farm's highly lucrative business through a massive moral boycott, unless the wealthy farmer immediately paid an exorbitant, extortionate sum of financial compensation for the severe, irreversible damages allegedly caused to their family's historically immaculate surname. The crushing moral dilemma landed heavily on Garrett's broad shoulders like a massive anvil made of solid lead. The vile threat was absolutely terrifyingly clear and possessed the undeniable potential to be utterly destructive given the strict, unforgiving societal customs of the era. In those difficult years, a woman's good reputation was undoubtedly her most fragile, most precious asset, and the venomous spreading gossip of high society could very well destroy the estate's highly lucrative export contracts, which relied heavily on highly conservative, wealthy buyers. But vastly more importantly, what genuinely tore the farmer apart on the inside was the crushing, agonizing knowledge that those filthy lies would permanently stain Cecilia's impeccable name forever, branding her cruelly with an invisible, shameful scarlet letter she would absolutely never be able to scrub off in the city. Garrett glanced backward, peering over his broad shoulder, and saw the incredibly petite woman painfully shrunk against the hard wall, clearly reliving her absolute worst, most terrifying nightmares, right in front of the man she deeply loved. She had spent her entire life existing merely as a mistreated, invisible ghost, just trying to survive the intrinsic, horrific cruelty of those vile people. And now the terrifying demons of her past had tracked her down and cornered her in the absolute only place in the entire world where she had ever been genuinely happy and deeply respected. Arthur, miraculously recovering a tiny fraction of his stolen courage upon seeing the massive farmer standing uncharacteristically silent and reflective, confidently reached into the inner pocket of his cheap suit jacket and pulled out a highly official-looking document covered in notary stamps. A completely forged, utterly absurd contract of debt confession demanding the staggering sum of $100,000, and aggressively shoved it toward Garrett's broad chest. With a deeply cynical, twisted smirk, the cowardly uncle smoothly warned that their eternal, absolute silence possessed a fixed, non-negotiable price, and that the requested cash would amicably, quietly resolve the entirely regrettable misunderstanding, completely sparing the poor, unfortunate girl from being violently dragged through the filthy mud of public humiliation across the front pages of the city's gossip rags. The rage actively boiling inside Garrett was a highly violent, incredibly destructive tempest, barely contained, at immense personal cost. His massive fists clenched so incredibly tightly that his knuckles audibly popped and turned stark white beneath his sun-bronzed skin, and the overwhelming, primal urge to violently grab the two despicable blackmailers by their throats and literally kick them off his property throbbed intensely in the highly visible, bulging veins of his muscular arms and thick neck. But he actually hesitated for a tiny fraction of a second, staring with pure hatred at the damned piece of paper shoved in his direction. Paying that filthy extortion money meant not only cowardly surrendering to pure evil, but actively financing and feeding the deeply despicable parasites who had ruthlessly sucked away the youth, the joy, and the very sanity of the woman he loved with absolutely every single fiber of his being. On the other hand, violently screaming and kicking them out would guarantee that Beatrice's highly venomous tongue would instantly destroy Cecilia's reputation in the big city, rapidly transforming her peaceful life into an absolute living hell of sideways glances and permanently closed doors. The incredibly agonizing, soul-tearing weight of the decision caused Garrett's breathing to become terrifyingly heavy and loudly ragged. Cecilia, possessing a deeply unique, highly perceptive emotional intelligence, perfectly understood the incredibly dark calculus and the massive personal sacrifice currently raging inside Garrett's mind solely to protect her, and she subsequently took an incredibly brave action that utterly shattered the farmer's heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. She slowly peeled herself away from the brick wall, took one incredibly slow, violently trembling step forward, her highly sweating hands nervously smoothing down her long blue cotton skirt, and stated in a painfully low, completely monotonous and utterly defeated voice that her aunt and uncle were completely right. Without even daring to glance up at Garrett, keeping her terrified eyes locked firmly onto the wooden floorboards, Cecilia coldly stated that she would quickly pack up her few pieces of clothing into her old valise and permanently leave in the exact same carriage with Arthur and Beatrice that very afternoon, actively sacrificing her own hard-won happiness and newfound freedom simply to ensure she did not tarnish the spotless, respected name of the Golden Linden estate and the honorable reputation of the great man who had so graciously saved her. Garrett's entire world seemed to completely stop spinning in that exact agonizing second, the suffocating silence of the yard broken only by the highly mournful distant song of a lone bird. The utterly heartbreaking sight of his phenomenally brilliant manager, with her head bowed in submission once again, totally giving up the fight and actively accepting the incredibly brutal, agonizing sacrifice of willingly returning to a literal living hell purely to protect his lands and his name, was the highly explosive spark that violently detonated the absolute final strongest barrier of his previously closed-off heart. The very air vibrated intensely with a tension so thick and palpable it could literally be sliced with the blade of a hunting knife, perfectly setting the dramatic stage for the singular action that would permanently alter the course of history for absolutely everyone present on that porch. Garrett stood completely frozen for an instant that seemed to stretch for an entire eternity, his intense gaze locked furiously onto Cecilia's hunched, defeated back as she walked excruciatingly slowly toward the heavy door of the big house with incredibly small, heavy steps, looking exactly like someone carrying the immense weight of a literal death sentence upon her fragile shoulders. The birds had entirely stopped singing. The wind had completely ceased blowing. The golden petals of the grand linden tree continued falling in agonizing slow motion, painting the tense silence in brilliant shades of yellow. Arthur snorted with vile satisfaction, greedily rubbing his filthy hands together in a deeply vulgar, disgusting display of premature victory, and Beatrice arrogantly opened her mouth to start barking cruel orders at Cecilia regarding exactly which luggage she was or was not permitted to bring. But then it happened. Garrett finally moved. It was absolutely not a slow, hesitant movement. The massive farmer aggressively pivoted on his heels with a terrifying speed that actually made Arthur stumble backward 2 highly unsteady steps. He violently crossed the porch in 3 massive, incredibly forceful strides, and easily caught up to Cecilia right before her hand even touched the brass doorknob. His incredibly large, calloused hand closed with absolute stunning delicacy entirely around her thin, fragile wrist, and the physical contact was so surprisingly soft and gentle that it contrasted violently with the raging tempest actively exploding inside his chest. Cecilia froze dead in her tracks, her entire body rigid with terror, lacking the courage to even turn around. Garrett tangibly felt the violent vibration of the tremors running up the woman's arm and took a massive, deep breath, completely filling his lungs with the comforting scent of the sweet lavender soap she always used in her hair. Then, with an incredibly low, deeply firm voice that was intended exclusively for her ears alone, he stated that she was absolutely not going to take even one more step. He firmly declared that she was not going anywhere, and that this house was exactly where she belonged, because she was officially home. Cecilia finally turned around, her pale face entirely soaked in silent, hot tears that cascaded rapidly down her cheeks without her even consciously realizing she was crying. Garrett absolutely did not look away from her eyes for even a tiny fraction of a second. Then, firmly keeping his large hand wrapped securely around Cecilia's wrist like an incredibly strong, deeply protective anchor, he slowly turned his massive body to fully face Arthur and Beatrice with a terrifying expression on his face that literally made the blood freeze completely solid in the veins of the 2 greedy blackmailers. It was not loud, expansive anger. It was not a screaming, violent fury. It was something infinitely more terrifying. It was the absolute, icy, completely resolute calm of an incredibly powerful man who has just made a final decision from which he will never, ever back down, even if the entire world were to violently crumble to dust all around him. The farmer stated, his voice deadly quiet, that he was only going to speak exactly once, and that it would be highly advisable for the two of them to listen with extremely close attention, because there would absolutely be no repetitions. Garrett loudly declared, his booming voice echoing from a very deep place in his broad chest, that Cecilia was absolutely not a secret, and she was most certainly not a shame. He proclaimed that she was the most phenomenally intelligent, undeniably honest, and entirely worthy woman he had ever had the privilege of knowing in his entire life, and that if there was absolutely anyone standing on that porch who should be feeling profound, burning shame, it was exactly the two vile, disgusting people who had spent decades ruthlessly using her incredible talent to illegally enrich their rotting store, without ever giving her in return even the absolute bare minimum of human respect and basic dignity that any living creature inherently deserves. Garrett's powerful voice did not tremble, even slightly. He coldly warned them that the blatantly forged contract Arthur was currently clutching in his sweaty hand would be personally delivered directly to the county sheriff that very week, perfectly accompanied by a highly detailed, legally binding financial report accounting for every single stolen penny the two of them had actively embezzled over the years by illegally exploiting Cecilia's unpaid, slave-like labor. And he finally concluded, aggressively pointing a thick finger directly toward the open iron gates at the far end of the property, that they had exactly 2 short minutes to get their pathetic bodies back into their rented carriage and vanish completely off his lands before he actively called his farmhands over to physically hasten their departure. Beatrice opened her mouth to shriek a retort, her lip heavily coated in cheap red lipstick, trembling violently with barely contained toxic rage, but something in the absolute, terrifyingly inflexible, deadly glare of the massive farmer instantly silenced her completely. She had absolutely never seen human eyes look quite like that. A dark, incredibly dangerous, determined flame that fundamentally refused to accept any bargains and entirely lacked the capacity to retreat. Arthur, being intrinsically much more cowardly than his wicked wife by nature, had already rapidly shoved the forged contract deeply back into his suit pocket and was actively retreating backward toward the wooden stairs, frantically yanking off his crushed hat with a terrified haste that bordered on the utterly ridiculous. It still took Beatrice a few highly tense seconds to finally yield, aggressively glaring at her niece with a look that desperately tried to be highly threatening. But the only thing it actually revealed was the deeply pathetic bitterness of a miserable person who has lost and knows with absolute certainty that she has lost definitively and irreversibly. Without a single final word, without offering any form of goodbye, she stomped heavily down the wooden stairs, her cheap dress dragging loudly across the gravel, and climbed into the waiting carriage, which was already shaking violently due to Arthur's frantic, terrified haste. The heavy iron wheels spun wildly, violently kicking up a massive cloud of pale, earthy dust, and the dark, retreating silhouette of the vehicle rapidly shrank further down the country dirt road until it disappeared completely forever behind the lush green curve of the overgrown hillside. The profound silence that actively settled over the vast yard of the Golden Linden estate immediately after that chaotic departure was of a completely different, entirely alien nature compared to all the suffocating silences that had come before. It was a remarkably clean silence, an incredibly renewed silence, exactly like the deeply fresh, highly breathable air that settles comfortably over the land immediately after a violent thunderstorm, when the absolute last echoes of thunder have finally rolled far, far away. Mrs. Martha, who had breathlessly watched the entire dramatic scene unfold directly from the kitchen window, with her frantic heart lodged firmly in her throat, furiously wiped her joyful tears on her apron and let out a massively long, highly relieved sigh. The rugged farmhands who were actively working near the wooden fences had also stopped completely, knowingly exchanging deeply respectful glances of pure admiration for their boss. But absolutely none of those external things currently existed in Garrett's highly narrowed field of vision. The absolute only world that genuinely mattered to him right then existed solely inside that small, incredibly sacred circle actively formed by the two bodies standing entirely still on the wooden porch, still firmly tethered to one another by the incredibly delicate pale wrist he continued to hold gently. Cecilia absolutely could not stop her violent trembling, even though the hot tears had finally ceased falling. She stared intensely down at the farmer's muddy leather boots, completely incapable of lifting her flushed face, feeling the incredibly intense, comforting heat radiating directly from his large hand into her cold skin. Then Garrett finally released his grip on her wrist, but only so he could gently reach out with two rough fingers to softly lift Cecilia's violently trembling chin, raising her face with the absolute extreme, breathtaking delicacy of someone carefully handling the world's most fragile fine china. Her beautiful eyes, still red and shining brilliantly with unshed tears, finally met his, and what she saw residing deeply within them was more than enough to completely steal the very air straight from her lungs. The highly oppressive, suffocating darkness of his long, terrible morning was entirely gone. In its place was an incredibly warm, brilliantly open, and beautifully vulnerable clarity that she had absolutely never witnessed in any human eye before. A stunning clarity that loudly declared, entirely without the clumsy aid of spoken words, exactly what was absolutely impossible to fake or successfully hide. Garrett softly murmured her name with an earth-shattering tenderness that instantly dismantled every single defensive wall she had painstakingly built around her heart over the course of 24 miserable years of deep invisibility and cruel rejection. He told her that since the very first night he found her in that rain-soaked office, fiercely hunched over those ruined papers, with her tongue caught between her teeth and her brow heavily furrowed in deep concentration, he knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had irrevocably shifted forever inside of him. He firmly declared that she had initially entered his broken house simply as a desperate employee, but had miraculously become, completely without him even realizing it, the very rhythm, the necessary breath, and the beating heart of that entire place. He admitted, his voice thick with emotion, that for a very long time he genuinely believed he absolutely no longer deserved to feel anything good in this world, that his crushing grief had violently stripped him of that fundamental right. But she had undeniably proven, every single day, without ever once asking for his permission and without ever demanding any form of recognition, that life absolutely still possessed immense meaning, a profoundly beautiful purpose, and a highly luminous, undeniable reason to be lived. And then, with his deep voice heavily choked by an emotion so incredibly genuine that it seemed to make the very branches of the great golden linden tree vibrate, Garrett softly asked if she would do him the incredible, unimaginable honor of becoming the true master of this estate, the proud bearer of his name, and the sole owner of whatever pieces remained of his battered heart, actively allowing him to spend absolutely every single day he had left on this earth, desperately trying to be a man worthy of a woman like her. Cecilia's racing heart was exactly like a panicked bird frantically beating its fragile wings against a cage that was entirely too small. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and the very few words that miraculously managed to escape were heavily choked by small, ragged sobs she actively tried to suppress. Entirely without success, she confessed that for her entire miserable life she had genuinely deeply believed she was a terrible burden to the world, an utterly worthless nuisance who simply consumed other people's space while having absolutely nothing good to offer in return beyond her highly specific ability to quietly add up numbers in total silence. But she told him that in those incredibly transformative months spent inside that grand house, she had gloriously discovered that her simple numbers actually possessed the immense power to literally save lives, and that her careful, tender attention could miraculously awaken the dead. And she finally said that yes, with every single shattered piece of her heavily reconstructed and newly reborn soul, she absolutely wanted to be the master of those rich lands and the sole guardian of that enormous, incredibly courageous heart that had just so fiercely defended her honor in front of the entire world. When Garrett finally pulled her into a deep embrace, his massive, incredibly warm arms wrapping entirely and completely around her tiny, fragile shoulders, Cecilia felt for the absolute first time in her entire life the real, incredibly visceral, undeniable meaning of the word home. Then it absolutely wasn't a physical street address, and it certainly wasn't just a simple roof supported by 4 wooden walls. It was exactly that broad, strong chest vibrating warmly against her forehead. It was exactly that intoxicating, comforting smell of sweet tobacco and rich, damp earth. It was exactly that absolute, unbreakable firmness that loudly declared, entirely without a voice, that absolutely nothing and nobody in the entire world would ever be able to forcefully tear her away from her rightful place again. Mrs. Martha, who had by now completely and utterly abandoned any lingering pretense of polite discretion, forcefully threw open the kitchen window and loudly yelled out to the cheering farmhands that it was officially time to start preparing a massive feast, because there was finally, truly, something wonderfully, genuinely good to loudly celebrate on those previously suffering lands. If you have made it this far with a wonderfully tight heart and a deeply warmed soul, actively cheering for this incredible couple since the very first lines of this video, please let me know down in the comments exactly what you felt in this highly emotional moment. It is precisely for breathtaking moments like this that stories like these genuinely exist. Comment also if you have ever been through a remotely similar situation in your own life, where you finally found your true place and your special person when you absolutely least expected it. These comments are genuinely the greatest, most fulfilling reward of this work of bringing you stories that truly touch people. The highly anticipated wedding of Garrett and Cecilia joyously took place on a crisp, beautiful October morning of the very next year, directly beneath the spectacularly golden, highly perfumed canopy of the immense linden tree, which had miraculously returned to full bloom. The ceremony was incredibly simple, primarily because the two of them absolutely never required flashy ornaments to make exactly what they genuinely felt highly visible to the world. The town's beloved minister, Reverend Miller, rode all the way out to the estate on horseback and officially performed the sacred blessing right in the open yard, with the beaming farmhands and their families gathered warmly around the incredibly happy couple, acting exactly like a massively expanded, genuinely loving family. Cecilia wore a breathtakingly simple white linen dress that Mrs. Martha had painstakingly sewn by hand over several weeks, carefully embroidering tiny, delicate linden flowers entirely along the bottom hem of the flowing skirt. She wore her rich brown hair completely loose for the absolute first time that Garrett could ever recall seeing, falling in soft, beautiful waves over her delicate shoulders, and the incredibly clear morning light of October spilled directly over her in a highly magical way that actually made the massive farmer completely forget how to breathe for one entire breathtaking moment. Garrett wore his absolute best, tailored beige linen suit, with a vibrant yellow flower carefully pinned to his lapel, and he possessed in his dark eyes that incredibly new, totally open, and brilliantly radiant clarity that had permanently, irreversibly replaced the suffocating darkness of his terrible years of mourning. When Reverend Miller formally asked if he took her to be his lawfully wedded wife, Garrett confidently answered, before the sacred question had even fully finished being spoken, answering with a conviction so incredibly complete and so booming that it instantly provoked highly emotional, joyous laughter among all the gathered guests. When it was finally Cecilia's turn to speak, she proudly raised her chin, looked deeply into her husband's dark eyes with a stunning firmness and a profound love that absolutely only years of shared pain can successfully produce, and she said, "I do," with an incredibly clear, highly secure voice that she had permanently learned to never, ever hide again. When the Reverend finally declared them lawfully united, Mrs. Martha wept so openly and loudly that the farmhands around her immediately began to laugh with deep affection, and the absolute oldest among them, a white-bearded man named Ernest, who had actively worked on those very lands since long before Garrett was even born, excitedly ripped his straw hat off his head and violently hurled it high into the air while letting out a hoarse, joyous shout of celebration that happily echoed across the green orchards, until it entirely lost itself over the distant horizon. The incredibly prosperous years that immediately followed the joyous wedding were the living, highly incontestable, undeniable proof that true love is absolutely not merely an invisible feeling that passively inhabits the chest, but a highly constructive, deeply practical, and completely transformative force that tangibly manifests itself in the real, physical world. Cecilia, now with Garrett's highly respected surname officially engraved on all the legal county documents, dove headfirst into the administration of the massive estate with a miraculously renewed and heavily multiplied energy. She aggressively began working not only with the financial ledgers and the complex banking negotiations, but also by fiercely studying, entirely on her own, the newest, highly advanced agricultural processing techniques that arrived in specialized agronomy magazines from the major city centers. She expertly convinced Garrett to invest heavily and construct their very own private apple cider mill and packing house right there on the estate, effectively cutting out the greedy city middlemen who previously stole a massive portion of the operational profits. The financial result of this brilliant move was highly immediate and absolutely spectacular. Garrett, in turn, surprisingly revealed in the heavily profitable following years an incredible hidden facet that his deep mourning had previously buried alive. He was a highly instinctive, phenomenal business negotiator, perfectly capable of looking deeply into the eyes of a wealthy city buyer and sensing, with almost terrifying animalistic precision, exactly how much money that man was genuinely willing to pay for their premium crates of fruit. With Cecilia brilliantly commanding the complex numbers and Garrett flawlessly dominating the direct negotiations, the Golden Linden estate completely ceased being merely a successfully recovered rural property and rapidly evolved into the absolute, unquestionable reference point for incredible agricultural quality and groundbreaking innovation for the entire region. Wealthy buyers all the way from New York City and Boston began eagerly sending personal letters actively begging for business meetings. A highly prestigious European exporter even arrived by ship specially to visit that legendary estate he had heard so incredibly much about. And he was graciously received directly by Cecilia, who had incredibly managed to learn the basics of his language purely through an old dictionary. welcoming him with a profound courtesy and a staggering competence that left him absolutely, utterly speechless. The massive, highly lucrative export contract to Europe that she successfully closed that very month miraculously tripled the estate's annual profits. But it was truly, in the deeply quiet, peaceful nights on the estate, completely far removed from stressful business and complex contracts, that the absolute true, immeasurable wealth of that marriage revealed itself with the greatest intensity. The sprawling wooden porch of the big house rapidly became the absolute favorite, sacred sanctuary of the two of them. Every single night, completely regardless of their physical exhaustion or the massive amount of pending work, they comfortably sat side by side in the woven wicker lounge chairs with a steaming pot of coffee placed directly in the center and the incredibly vast, star-filled sky of upstate New York opening up in all its splendid, breathtaking immensity directly above their heads. Garrett had happily resumed the relaxing habit of enjoying a cigar after dinner, but he did so now with a deeply relaxed, genuine pleasure and absolutely not with the desperate, suffocating emotional anesthesia of his former dark years. Cecilia always brought out her beloved green-covered notebook, but as time rapidly passed, the dense financial notes began sharing space with an entirely new, deeply beautiful practice. She began writing directly onto the ruled pages incredible little short stories, beautiful fragments of memories, stunning descriptions of how the morning light perfectly hit the orchards, the exact way Garrett's eyes crinkled warmly at the corners whenever he laughed, the intoxicating, earthy smell of the rich soil immediately following a heavy summer rainstorm. Garrett accidentally discovered the beautiful new use of the green notebook on a sunny afternoon when Cecilia had briefly stepped out to thoroughly inspect the new cider mill, with the foreman casually leaving the green object resting wide open on top of the office desk. He casually approached with absolutely no intention of snooping, but his dark eyes were instantly captured by a stunning line written in bright blue ink that stated there was a man whose hands were simply far too large for the incredible, breathtaking delicacy with which he touched the fragile things of the world, and that it was absolutely, undeniably impossible not to fiercely love every single one of his beautiful contradictions. Garrett very slowly closed the notebook, placed it incredibly carefully back in the exact, precise spot where she had left it, and quietly walked out of the office, feeling an intense, highly comforting heat rapidly occupy every single inch of his face. That very night, out on the dark porch, while Cecilia was peacefully writing by the soft light of the oil lamp, he quietly approached from behind, bent down slightly, and pressed an incredibly long, deeply tender kiss directly onto the top of her head, completely without uttering a single word, and Cecilia, absolutely without lifting her eyes from the written page, smiled the most incredibly complete, joyful smile of her entire life. Mrs. Martha actually managed to celebrate her 70th birthday while still actively working on the grand estate, vehemently, loudly refusing absolutely any soft suggestion of well-deserved rest that Cecilia actively tried to impose upon her with deep affection. She proudly stated, loudly banging her wooden spoon aggressively against the rim of a metal pot for added dramatic emphasis, that a woman who completely stops working immediately stops truly living, and that as long as that massive wood-burning stove remained standing, she would absolutely be standing right in front of it. Garrett absolutely loved recounting that specific fiery phrase to the many wealthy visitors of the estate with a highly evident, deeply paternal pride. The old cook had rapidly become so incredibly much more than a mere employee over the passing years, wonderfully transforming into Cecilia's closest, most trusted confidant, Garrett's incredibly wise, veiled advisor, and the absolute warmest, most incredibly nourishing beating heart of the entire massive property. She finally retired many years later, highly cared for and treated with absolutely all the deep dignity and profound respect she so richly deserved, living comfortably in a beautiful, remodeled back room of the grand house, peacefully spending her twilight days, carefully teaching the young new cooks the highly guarded secrets of her incredibly moist apple cakes and her perfectly timed brewed coffee. The Golden Linden estate simply kept growing and expanding over the passing years, exactly like a massively powerful living organism, easily absorbing the neighboring lands that their struggling owners willingly sold for highly reasonable prices, massively expanding the green orchards, successfully constructing new state-of-the-art processing barns, and finally, right at the dawn of the 1940s, proudly installing the very first modern telegraph communication lines that connected the rural property absolutely directly to the offices of the wealthy exporters in the big city. Cecilia, whose rich brown hair was now beautifully interwoven with shining silver strands that actively caught the sunlight, had become a highly known and incredibly respected figure across the entire region. The other wealthy farm owners from the town frequently traveled specifically to see her, to desperately ask for complex administrative advice, and she graciously gave it with the exact same tranquil, open generosity with which she had absolutely always treated human knowledge, genuinely believing that wisdom absolutely never diminishes when it is freely shared, but rather, on the contrary, it massively multiplies and beautifully flourishes. Garrett aged exactly in the highly dignified manner that men of incredibly true character age, becoming vastly more himself with every passing year, significantly more serene, incredibly deeper, and possessing a highly robust, striking beauty that the constant outdoor work meticulously sculpted directly into every single line of his handsome face. His hair turned completely, blindingly white by the time he reached his 50s, and Cecilia absolutely loved passing her delicate fingers through it on the dark porch at night, lovingly teasing him that he had somehow managed to become even more impossible to safely ignore. Garrett, on those incredibly special occasions, would gently take her hand, slowly turn her palm facing upward, and closely examine the deep calluses from years of writing. The beautiful gold rings she now proudly wore, and the undeniable marks of time that absolutely failed to erase even a single ounce of the incredible, breathtaking delicacy of her features. He always said, whenever he looked deeply at Cecilia's hands, that he had absolutely never truly understood the real meaning of the word providence, until the incredible night when a violent autumn storm miraculously sent him that insomniac woman carrying a cheap kerosene lantern and a green-covered notebook to miraculously save the life of an absolute fool who had completely given up on himself. The highly disgraced names of Arthur and Beatrice were absolutely never pronounced on the estate ever again. Quiet rumors eventually arrived, many years later, that their mercantile store had completely utterly gone bankrupt, and that the miserable couple had been forced to shamefully move far away to a tiny rural town in Pennsylvania, where they currently lived in incredibly modest, nearly impoverished conditions. Cecilia listened to the news with a highly prolonged, incredibly thoughtful silence, simply staring out at the lush green fields far beyond the office window. Garrett, who was carefully observing her face with incredibly close attention, softly asked what she was thinking about that situation. Cecilia remained completely silent for a few more seconds, slowly turned to her husband with an incredibly tranquil, peaceful look in her eyes, and softly stated that she honestly felt absolutely nothing but a very simple, profound peace. She firmly declared that her old bitter resentment for Arthur and Beatrice had completely dried up exactly like a shallow puddle of rain on a hot summer day, not by the sheer force of some grand, conscious decision, but completely naturally. simply as her life became so incredibly full of highly beautiful, deeply good things that there was absolutely no empty space left inside of her to hoard any toxic grudges. Garrett just stood there looking at her for a very long moment, wearing that exact specific crooked smile from the corners of his mouth that she had lovingly catalogued as her absolute favorite among all the smiles in the entire world. And he simply stated that she was undoubtedly the absolute wisest person he had ever known. The winter of 1952 fell upon upstate New York with an incredibly unusual, breathtaking gentleness, completely lacking the violent, destructive blizzards that sometimes violently destroyed the delicate buds of the orchards at the turn of January. The soothing warmth of the late afternoons was incredibly benign and beautifully golden, exactly the specific type of comfortable heat that actively invites deep rest entirely without asking for any apologies. On one of those absolutely perfect, flawless afternoons, Garrett and Cecilia stepped out to walk peacefully through the long avenues of the orchards, just exactly as they had done hundreds and hundreds of times over the passing years, with their hands comfortably intertwined in a gesture so incredibly naturalized that the two of them barely even consciously registered when they did it anymore, acting exactly as if their hands simply inherently knew where their rightful place was. The new young foreman, a hard-working boy with a thin moustache named Bennett, who had actively grown up on the estate, happily saw them passing between the long rows of apple trees heavily laden with crisp red fruit, and respectfully lowered his hat in a highly genuine display of deep affection. The numerous other workers happily did exactly the same, offering bright smiles that went far, far beyond any mandatory cordiality and easily reached the beautiful border of true, loving care. Cecilia had beautifully turned 50 that very month, and she had gracefully arrived at maturity with an incredibly serene grace that time had gently deposited upon her exactly as if it were a precious gift. Her hair, absolutely completely silver now, she wore in a vastly looser, softer bun than before, and gentle, beautiful lines traced the corners of her eyes and her mouth, but they were undeniably the lines of someone who had spent their life smiling very much, absolutely not of someone who had lived heavily suffering. She carried in her incredibly straight back and her high, proud forehead the undeniable, powerful posture of a woman who had firmly learned the exact, unshakable value of herself and would absolutely never, ever lower her head in front of anyone again. Right by her side, Garrett, with his shockingly white hair and his incredibly broad shoulders, advanced through the massive orchards with the silent, highly confident ownership of a man who intimately knows absolutely every single inch of his land and deeply loves it exactly as he knows and loves himself. They stopped comfortably near the very end of the main avenue at the exact, perfect spot from where they could clearly see the absolute entirety of the massive property all at once. The distant horizon stretched vastly all the way to the bluish rolling hills, far in the distance, deeply covered by dark patches of native wild forest that Cecilia had brilliantly convinced Garrett to legally preserve right from the beginning. The incredible orchards, heavily worked with the intense care of 20 years of accumulated agricultural knowledge, formed a massive rolling carpet of deep, vibrant green, beautifully dotted by the bright, vivid red of the incredibly ripe fruit. The massive new cider mill actively hummed with the incredibly soft, rhythmic roar of its expensive machinery, the sweet, highly intoxicating smell of processing apples spreading beautifully through the warm afternoon air. The grand main house, spectacularly remodeled and heavily expanded over the passing years, now proudly featured immaculately whitewashed walls and massive, wide windows with deep green wooden shutters that beautifully allowed the cool country breeze to enter entirely freely. Garrett stopped walking, stood perfectly still, and looked intensely at that sprawling, breathtaking landscape for a very long time, in absolute heavy silence, with his dark eyes slowly passing over every single minute detail of exactly what the two of them had miraculously built together. Cecilia was actively looking too, tangibly feeling the incredibly large, calloused hand of her husband gently squeeze hers. Then she proudly raised her beautiful face to him, and Garrett softly lowered his, and their highly expressive eyes met in a profound exchange of glances that effortlessly contained 20 entire years of deeply shared history. He leaned his head slightly toward her. She gently rested her temple onto his broad shoulder, and they stayed exactly like that for an incredibly eternal, perfect moment, with the gentle winter sun warmly heating their white hair, while the vast living orchards practically breathed all around them. Garrett softly said, utilizing that incredibly hoarse, deeply gravelly voice that absolutely neither the passing years nor constant use had ever managed to fully soften, that there was once a very dark time when he used to look out over those exact same lands and could only see a massive, terrifying graveyard. He stated that the rotting fruit, the violently collapsed fences, and the crushing, heavy silence of the big house were absolutely nothing more than a perfect, terrifying mirror of exactly what was entirely dead inside of him. And that today, when he looked out at absolutely all of that, he saw undeniably the most incredibly alive thing that had ever existed anywhere in the entire world. Cecilia smiled brightly, utilizing that highly specific, beautiful smile that he had actively spent 20 entire years trying and completely failing to ever describe with total accuracy, and stated that the vast lands were indeed incredibly beautiful, but that exactly what he was truly seeing was absolutely not the beauty of the orchards. It was undeniably the breathtaking beauty of exactly what happens when two broken people completely decide that they are going to spectacularly bloom together in the exact same soil, entirely regardless of absolutely anything that the cruel world attempts to violently throw on top of them. Garrett just stood there actively looking at his beautiful wife for a very long, intense instant, possessing that deeply open, incredibly luminous gaze of his. And then he gently placed his large, free hand softly onto her face with that exact same breathtaking delicacy that she had lovingly catalogued on the very first page of her green notebook so many years before, tenderly caressing the soft line of her cheek with his rough thumb. And he simply stated exactly what he had said on that incredible afternoon by the side of the creek, exactly on that afternoon of his marriage proposal, exactly what he had told her in hundreds of incredibly different ways over 2 decades of shared, beautiful life, that she had entirely saved his complete life with a cheap kerosene lantern, a simple green notebook, and the incredibly silent, unshakable courage of a woman who absolutely didn't even know yet the true, staggering size of her own light. And that absolutely every single day, waking up directly beside her, was the highly concrete, undeniable proof that destiny knew exactly precisely what it was doing on that violent, stormy night in 1932, when it miraculously sent directly into the dark corridors of the Golden Linden estate the absolute most extraordinary person that upstate New York had ever produced. Cecilia let out a beautifully soft, highly genuine laugh, the exact kind of joyful laughter that belongs to someone who is so incredibly happy that the pure happiness simply overflows into the air in the form of sound, and playfully reminded him that on the night in question, the extraordinary person was completely soaking wet from the rain, covered in old ink. And so, incredibly terrified, that she practically fainted dead away when she heard his heavy boots violently creaking on the wooden floorboards right behind her. Garrett loudly laughed too, an incredibly deeply free laugh that aggressively burst from his broad chest, exactly as if it had been uniquely born to exist in that precise, flawless moment. and then he tightly squeezed her hand in his and happily resumed their peaceful walk through the long green avenues. In absolutely no hurry whatsoever, possessing the highly particular, profound tranquility of someone who has successfully already arrived exactly where they needed to arrive and can finally, happily enjoy absolutely every single step. The bright sun began to lower incredibly slowly over the rolling hills far in the distance, beautifully tinting the vast sky in highly warm, breathtaking shades of rich terracotta, soft lilac, and burning gold. The colossal linden tree, right in the central yard of the estate, which had silently witnessed absolutely every single dramatic chapter of that incredible story, absolutely every arrival and every departure, every single bitter tear and every joyful laugh, every violent storm and every incredibly clear morning that followed, softly swayed its massive branches, heavily loaded with golden blossoms in the gentle warm breeze of the late afternoon. The golden petals fell heavily in lazy, swirling eddies, beautifully covering the pale dirt of the yard with a highly luminous, magical carpet that perfectly caught the absolute last rays of the dying sun, exactly as if they were tiny, glowing embers. When they finally arrived back at the main yard, their hands still tightly intertwined, Cecilia actively stopped directly beneath the massive tree. She tilted her beautiful head backward and stared straight up, looking deeply at the crisp October sky through the incredibly dense canopy of golden flowers, actively feeling the soft petals falling beautifully over her silver hair, exactly like natural silk confetti. She gently closed her eyes, took a massive, incredibly deep breath, completely filling her lungs with the sweet, intoxicating perfume of the golden flowers perfectly mixed with the earthy smell of damp soil and ripe, sweet apples. And she thought deeply about the terrified young woman carrying the cracked leather valise who had desperately arrived down that very same dusty road on a freezing day in 1932, with her head bowed extremely low and her battered heart entirely broken from a vicious rejection that she had incorrectly accepted as the absolute truth regarding her own inherent value. She thought about exactly how incredibly wrong that young woman had been about herself. Garrett stood completely still right beside her, actively observing the serene, highly peaceful face of his beautiful wife, with the incredibly tranquil, entirely fulfilled expression of a man who has finally reached the absolute end of an incredibly long, highly difficult journey and miraculously found there, at his ultimate destination, a landscape vastly more beautiful than he could have ever possibly imagined on the absolute worst of his darkest days. He comfortably placed his massive arm warmly over her shoulders. She gently rested her head firmly against him, and they simply stayed right there beneath the blooming golden tree, while the brilliant golden afternoon slowly converted itself into a beautifully star-filled night, resting in an absolute perfect silence, possessing the specific type of deep peace that genuinely belongs exclusively to those who have truly, fiercely fought to rightfully earn it. And it was exactly like this, standing directly beneath the beautiful shower of golden petals from a magnificent tree that had miraculously learned how to beautifully bloom again, that the absolute most beautiful story in all of New York finally found its deep, lasting rest. Absolutely not the rest of an end, because incredible stories exactly like this one absolutely never, ever have an end, but the highly deserved, deeply peaceful rest of someone who has finally, truly arrived home.